Welcome back to another episode of Thunder Road Running podcast. We've got a very special guest with us today, Gareth Sandford, a very close friend of mine. He has journeyed the world in search of all the puzzle pieces regarding speed and speed reserve and track and field, especially in middle distance runners. And hopefully we're going to get into it a little bit today. Regarding Gareth's past, he is currently working as a postdoctoral researcher fellow at the University of British Columbia. That's in collaboration with the Canadian Sport Institute. On the Pacific side over there, Athletics Canada, 94 Forward, and MyTax Canada. Did I say that correctly? MyTax?
Yeah.
What's that stand for? I don't even know what that is.
Like an innovation program in Canada. Yeah.
Okay, nice. And then he did his PhD research in New Zealand, where he took his trip, which we'll talk about here in a second, studying the applications of anaerobic speed reserve with the high performance sport New Zealand, or within High Performance Sport New Zealand. That was also in cooperation with Auckland University of Technology. He also ran support for Athletics New Zealand going into the World Championships last year in Doha before the world went crazy. And while he was doing his PhD research, Gareth got to travel the world and test out elite athletes from all over the world looking for these puzzle pieces within middle distance athletes. And it was an amazing journey. One we're not going to get to dive into very deep today, but hopefully we'll kind of get to poke around and you know, kind of mine for some of the learnings he had while he was out there. But it was probably over 150 athletes, 7 months, and not just any athletes, y'all. We're talking elite. So it had to be, what was it, under 151, under 140?
Yeah, 155 and under, and then 210 and under on the women's side. Yeah.
Okay. And I'll have to come back and edit this part, but I might have to put up just all of the organizations that you passed through, just because it's amazing, the list of teams that you worked with, so that everybody can kind of see the amount of talent you came around, and then all over the world you traveled. So cool. What did you find?
So there were two main questions we were trying to answer. The first one was, how much sprinting speed is enough for elite middle distance runners alongside that aerobic piece to be able to be competitive in surging during a race or in the last lap kick? So that was one question. And a second question that emerged was, middle distance coaches were talking about how there's speed types of 800 meter, 1500 meter runners and endurance type of those same events. And that creates a lot of complexity. And the same type of athlete doesn't necessarily respond to the same type of training. And so a big part of the trip was using the visits to understand how coaches across different professional, collegiate, and national groups were training those different types of athletes. And then what we actually managed to do using the maximal sprinting speed, which you can measure over a 50-meter all-out sprint, and the maximal aerobic speed, which is like a 6-minute run or a 2K time trial, or even a 1,500-meter run. You can actually use those two landmarks to highlight someone who's more speed-based and more endurance-based, which then opens up a whole ton of discussions about, okay, well, how differently should we treat this athlete versus this athlete from a coaching and a training perspective.
Mm-hmm. I got you. So basically, would you consider an athlete speed-based or endurance-based? And then, you know, where was the overlap? Right? And everything in between. Yeah. And looking for the differences specifically in their profiles and how they approach training. I mean, I bet you saw a million different ways to go about training 800-meter athletes between all these places. And I know personally as a coach, the 800-meter space used to scare me a little bit when I was really early on, because like I knew how to build a base. I knew how to build an aerobic system. I knew how to, you know, manage speed, but I only knew how to do it one way. Where was the area of opportunity that you saw? Like was there a blanket area of opportunity over the different types of athletes
I think
in contact with? I
think the point you made about knowing the aerobic base and how to develop that well really resonates, because I think that's a high proportion of distance coaches. Is that ultimately is where a lot of the coach education and schooling is, and that's important. But the reality of that is that it is one approach, you know, and so it becomes very difficult when you then get someone who is more speed-based trying to go into that approach. It's like trying to put a square peg in a round hole. It's not quite going to fit. And so I think what it highlighted for me as a big take home was at the front end of our choices on how we approach training, we can better get the most out of people by understanding where they first sit on that continuum before we've even done any training sessions. And you can do that by testing and profiling. So like some of the work you do yourself with like speed testing and lactate testing, you can understand where someone sits. Are they more speed-based, more endurance-based? And then go, okay, from that, we can look at, okay, well, more endurance-based is probably more of a traditional training approach, like the one you described. But perhaps if you've got someone more along the speed side of things, there may be a more interval-based approach. And that doesn't necessarily mean high intensity interval training all the time, but using shorter intervals where you allow the body to keep lactate quite low. You can really develop someone aerobically at the beginning without having to go down the long volume continuous type route. So I think number one, that upfront approach of who am I, where do I sit, and then that can help guide whether you go more down a continuous or interval based route. Yeah. And of course, it's not an either or. There will be blends of these things, but more just where does your dominance sit of type of training style you give that type of athlete.
Yeah. So you're saying the speed guy still needs endurance training, and that can be accomplished through intervals. Why wouldn't you? I mean, I'm going to ask a very simple question. Why do they need endurance training? I mean, why would they not want a high lactate response if that's who they are?
Yeah, I mean, the starting point is the event demands, right? So the reality for a speed-based athlete, if you want to do the 800-meter run, 800-meter event, that lasts a minute 40, that's about a 65% aerobic contribution to the event.
Yeah.
So the way you might get to building an aerobic capacity to deal with that might be very different to someone who presents, if you've got like a Devin Dixon on one end versus like a Nick Simmons on the other end as an 815 type guy, you're going to approach that very, very differently. But the reality is if you still want to run the 800 meters, you're going to need to develop skills in both those areas.
Yeah. So you got to have the aerobic part. The event demands requires that it's aerobic. Even if you're an anaerobic guy, you're still going to have to figure out a way to develop it.
Yeah. It's just going to be the how of, getting there.
Yeah. So on the very, very far end, we're talking like 4.8 in the classification and the research that Gareth did. And maybe it's worth noting that, he kind of was breaking middle distance athletes up into roughly 3 categories, which was 4.8, and then 8 specialists kind of right down the middle. And then, as all you coaches out there, if you've had the 8 only, because they're very frustrating to work with. And usually they are also very frustrated because they're not good really at anything. They're just kind of a little bit good at everything. And maybe we can get into that too. And then you've got the 815, the little more strength-based 800-meter runner. And I want to know what would an endurance session look like for the guy on the very low end of the spectrum, the 4.8, somebody who can maybe run 22 seconds for 200. What would that look like?
An endurance? What do you mean by an endurance session?
Oh, well, like if we're looking to develop
type workout.
Yeah, like maybe an example that you saw or something there, because for me that would have been totally foreign, before I'd run into you.
So when you're talking about somebody with that kind of speed, generally speaking, they're going to be someone at a max all out 200, 300 meter effort. They're going to generate very, very high lactate. So over 20, which means that, they're probably quite fast twitch dominant. And that has some implications because there are times in those hard all out 300 speed endurance type sessions, you do want high lactate, but when you're developing aerobically, that's not really the aim. And so something you can do to cap that is make sure that the continuous efforts aren't too long. So for example, if you're trying to target a threshold type run, which we're talking about that second inflection point on a lactate curve. So between steady state where heart rate, where breathing is stable, to the point where it moves to not stable, that kind of targeted training session. At the beginning, because a speed-based athlete probably hasn't done too much of that work, it's probably what can you do?
Yeah.
Right? It's probably what can you do? And that might be a minute on, a minute off. Right.
Right.
And it might be 5 minutes on day one because you're trying to explore where's the starting point. But over time, you want to build up the accumulated volume of that to be able to run, probably between 3K is a good ballpark in maybe, 6 months to a year continuous, right? But you're not going to get there overnight. And I find like starting there alongside some shorter intervals is a good way to develop aerobically, because mechanically threshold pace is still turning your legs over relatively fast. Like, it's not plodding, and mechanically that's a lot more comfortable for a speed-based athlete who's not really that used to running slow. And equally, like, ultimately you can psychologically run for 15 minutes and be just about okay with that as a speed-based athlete. And if you're not, and if that ongoing presents a challenge, then maybe the 800 isn't for you, because you are going to have to do some of that type of work, and so I think, not overlooking for too much, but starting small and then building. And you can always shorten the rest, to increase the aerobic stimulus.
Gotcha. When I'm thinking about it, for whatever reason, the old Baylor coach came to mind with Jeremy Warner and Michael Johnson and those guys. And I know they did they were a rarity, and that it was very slow to fast, as far as training their 400-meter guys. And I think they started with like 10 by 200 or something, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And it was like starting at 35 seconds at the very beginning of the year, and then from 35, slowly throughout the year, they kind of started and worked down. And then, maybe the volume went up, and don't quote me on the exacts, but I know that was the theme for a while.
That kind of thing, in terms of an interval-based example to develop a speed-based athlete aerobically, is perfect, right? Like, the aim isn't necessarily to get faster, because the emphasis is aerobic stimulus, but it's probably to grow that volume from 10 by 200, with 30 seconds recovery, building that out to 15 to 20. And then, in time, it's maybe, 10 by 400, not again moving the pace, but just continuing and building out that aerobic stimulus.
I think the other thing I would ask if I was working with that guy would be like, how do I do that without, I hear this from people all the time. How do I do that without losing my speed? Coach, I'm going to get slow, and that's, I don't know where it came from, where it originated, but for some reason, people that have speed are always afraid of losing it. I guess, how do you navigate that? I don't want to get slow, that concern, right? Somebody that's new maybe to the 4.8.
Yeah, it's a good question. And as you say, one that comes up a lot. I think, one of the things that happens in our sport is often we think in continuums, right? We think of like, it's volume or it's speed, or, you train on your own or you train on a group. And like, the reality is that like, it's always somewhere in the middle, right? It's not one end or the other end. And so because you're a speed-based athlete coming into the 800, that doesn't mean we're all of a sudden going to drop all of the speed out of the program. Because often if you're coming to the 800 with some speed, that's your gift. And we want to manage and maximize that as whilst we build the 800. So like, in my view, gone are the days of not having speeds introduced in the program until like April, right? On a kind of Northern Hemisphere training program. Like, speed is in the program from week one of the season. We can get into in a little bit perhaps about what speed is in that sense. But it's not that, hey, we're now going to improve you aerobically, so we're not going to touch any of that speed stuff. That's not the case. It's always going to be there in some shape or form. And actually, like, psychologically, you can do little things like, you might do a tempo run and you've then had a bit of recovery. You then might run a fast 150 or something. Now, you're not going to do, 5 or 6 of them. You're just going to do one, so that you still feel like you have that there. So I think you always, as a coach, managing the physiology and the psychology together, right? Because like you say, that I want to feel fast is not necessarily a physical thing.
Right.
So I think you sprinkle that as the athlete needs it, and your job as the coach is just to hold the rein so that it's not detrimental.
Right. So continue developing their natural abilities alongside whatever it is that the event demands. So if they are demanding a little more endurance to be able to be a good 800-meter runner, you got to build it while managing the speed profile of this 4.8 guy.
That's right. And it's not like all of these things are, they compound, right, over time. And so, the time course of adapting aerobically and anaerobically are very, very different, right? Mm-hmm. Anaerobic sessions, like the hard sort of 300, 400s, all out off long rest, high lactate, like you maybe need 2 or 3 of those to get a solid adaptation and you're pretty much ready to go. Like that's very, very quick. It's a big hammer, which means there's high risk, high reward. Whereas that aerobic system tends to take a longer time frame, right? That just needs continual topping up and building on over time. And so, yeah, I think it's about expectations and taking a long-term view on that development as well.
Okay. So kind of shifting over to the 815 guy, the classification of maybe somebody a little more strength based. And, the classic question is like, maybe I can't kick or my kick sucks. How do I get better at this? Like how, I'm lose a race in the last 200 meters every time, I have to run all out from the gun to give myself a shot. What do you tell that guy? And it might be worth even, do you define speed for that person that doesn't have it first before you kind of answer that question, or what do you think the good order would be?
I think it's probably good for us actually to start how do you develop speed in a distance runner period?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Okay. There you go.
And then we can work into that specific example where maybe it's not happened. So, a perception sometimes is that, you're a distance runner because you're not inherently fast. Otherwise you'd have done the sprint events, right? But that doesn't mean that you can't improve. There's a great example of that's publicly available, but Courtney Frerichs, who many of you will know, like when she joined the Bowerman Track Club, she was saying like she hadn't really done any of that top end speed. And when I talk about speed, I'm talking about maximal 3 to 6 seconds all out effort, maximal sprinting speed, usually measured over 50 meters or like a flying 30, that kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So she said she'd never done that kind of work. And she timed her 400 and it was a 67 for 400.
That's so bad.
Right? And then a couple years of working on that with Gary and the team, as I say, this is all publicly available information. She managed to drop it down to 61 after year 1, right? And then after the second year, she was able to drop it down to 59, right? Now, on world terms of sprinting, Courtney Frerichs is never going to be Natasha Hastings, is never going to be Sanya Richards-Ross, but she's not trying to be. She's trying to be the best of herself and minimize something that, as part of her overall arsenal of being an elite middle distance runner, was limiting her.
Yeah.
And she's shown that through doing that alongside a volume-based program, right? Using altitude, doing all that stuff, that you can still make inroads on your maximal sprinting speed. Now, that's important for a number of reasons. When you go to kick, one of the things that you end up having to do is biomechanically adjust, right? You've got to find a way of putting more force in the floor to go faster.
More force, more speed.
Right. And so, and as you go faster, you're having to do that in a shorter and shorter ground contact time, right? And so if you don't have a high ceiling, then that means you don't have very far to go when it comes down to putting more force in the ground. So if the demand to close on the last lap is, say, 50 seconds in a 1500 meters, and your 400 speed is 54 seconds, it doesn't matter if you're even fresh. If you're fresh and you start the race on the last lap, you still can't win.
Right.
Right. So you can be as aerobically strong as a house, but if you don't also have that speed piece in that type of race, then you're going to get found out. Likewise, If it's fast from the gun, we're talking 55, 56 first laps for elite men's 1500. Like if you're not aerobically comfortable enough to deal with that pace, and that's hurting you too much, you're having to work too hard anaerobically to hold that pace, well, that's going to show up in the last lap and a half, right? You're just not going to be able to go with it. And so we often start with like these either ors, and we're kind of merging into the kick a bit here, but there are different race scenarios, and ultimately you want to build a toolbox that takes care of all of those scenarios.
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm just sitting here thinking about Freerix because you brought her up. And because, I mean, she was no slouch, joining Bowerman. I mean, I watched her run I think she split 4:27 in the mile in a DMR, either at nationals or at SECs. And I mean, she came from the back and made everybody on the track look like they were the B team. You know what I mean? And I never would have guessed she couldn't run faster than 67 seconds. You know what I mean? Because she was essentially running that for a mile, to go and split that in the DMR. And it's just crazy to me that that's all that was there, and you take that aerobic system and then you teach it how to get out of its own way. And then you've got an indoor national record holder in the 5K, right?
Yeah. And so back to the kind of junior athlete and where do you start? It's like your emphasis needs to be on maximizing both ends of the continuum, right? The aerobic side and the sprinting speed side. And those are different skill sets.
Right.
They're different skill sets. And it doesn't mean that you can't get faster in terms of your maximal sprinting speed when you're older. We just talked through a nice example of how you can do that, but it just becomes harder. Right? Because sprinting, as we talked about, is limited by the amount of force you put in the floor.
Yeah.
Right. And that's a skill that you're having to develop in terms of a biomechanical pattern. Right. And so if you've gone years of just running mileage and not really touching that stuff, you're developing biomechanical patterns at slower running paces, which has a physiological benefit, but there's perhaps a cost of just doing that biomechanically. Right. So making sure that you have that emphasis on both parts actually gives you a more rounded kind of profile to be more flexible, whether it's a slow first few laps and then a fast kick, or if it's the other way and it's actually fast from the gun. Because raising that ceiling actually enables you to run, coaches will talk about fast relax, right? And he looks smooth as butter.
Yeah.
And if you're having to work at a very high proportion of your speed reserve to meet a certain pace, that's not going to be relaxed. That's not going to be comfortable. Yeah. And that plays out even in the longer stuff, right? Like a 5K. So 13-minute 5K, 62s.
So,
right? So again, it's like that same thing of, if your PR's 64,
you got problems.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So next thing. So not the next thing, but for me, the next step, for a listener out there that goes, okay, well, I'm more like Freerix than I am like Devin Dixon. And I'm a developmental athlete. I still got time. I'm not washed up yet. I can start working on this before it's too late. What am I working on? How do I introduce this alongside, my base building stuff? You said, don't wait till April, which is pretty classic nowadays, but what does that look like? What do you tell that guy, that's like, well, okay, how do I do it?
I think there's a number of things. First of all, realizing that it's not, again, necessarily going to happen overnight, right? And it is a journey that if you've never done it before, might take you a year, 18 months to feel like, hey, I'm really getting this speed thing now. But that's okay because you have a whole career to, enjoy that. So a couple of things that are really easy at the beginning in terms of, say, plyometrics and low-level plyometrics are like jumping rope, and just getting good at stuff like that, or like running stairs, just getting used to that feeling of reacting off the ground, or using hills, hill sprints that encourage good mechanical postures where you're having to push into the floor, right? And
how long? Sorry.
Yeah, if your focus is the maximal sprinting speed, probably only 0 to 30 meters, not long, and an awful long recovery, right? Because you want these to be maximal.
Got it. So
Yes,
we're not looking for a response in the blood. We're not trying to boil our blood here.
exactly. Everything's
Gotcha.
about technique, getting a maximal effort. So probably putting it in the week, earlier in the week where you're not as tired is probably a good thing. And particularly if you're trying to train new techniques, new mechanical patterns, then I think, yeah, early in the week is good. Alongside that, you're probably also looking at things like, do I have any limits in my range of motion? Right. So some of these sprinting positions, your knees are going to come up to parallel, and you're wanting to make sure that you don't have any movement restrictions. So do you have good mobility in your hips?
Mm-hmm.
And from that perspective too, do you have any muscle imbalances, left versus right, that need working on in the gym? So you can see that there's a whole foundation that you're building
Mm-hmm.
to then really be able to be very good at expressing force on demand in a race where suddenly, okay, someone's made a move and I have to go, right? And this is laying a foundation to really enable you to go with that,
Mm-hmm.
and not have to take 3 or 4 seconds to wind up, right? To then be able to catch it because the race is gone. And of course, there is a psychological piece to that and a tactical piece to that. But purely physically, you want to be able to have the gears to be able to change gears quickly and efficiently.
Well, let's say a developmental athlete coming out of high school, maybe, and they've shifted their training and they've been classified. They kind of understand where they sit on that continuum, or at least they think they do. And they're kind of looking to move on to that next level. And whether that's college or some club team or something somewhere, or it's a pro looking, or it's a college kid looking to go pro. And they feel like they kind of need something, something specific. How attached should you be to, kind of how you see your own classification, and then what should you look for, making that next step, to make sure that you get the right exposure there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think a couple of important things to say about the continuum. First of all, that it is going to be fluid over time.
Mm-hmm.
So in talking with senior athletes, there are some athletes I've spoken to that were like, yeah, I've been all three, right? Like I started my career as a 400-meter athlete, and then I developed over a few years, 5-6 years around the 800, ran really well. Then I had a few injuries. Perhaps during the injuries didn't take care of that neuromuscular side as much, the speed side as much. And then when I came back, actually felt that I was better placed because I'd had 7-8 years of developing aerobically to have a better go at the 1500, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it is going to be a thing of the continuum is where are you today? But as you train in different training blocks, right, those two things are going to move. The aerobic system and the sprint ceiling are going to move to a point. So it's something to, again, be always mindful of looking at where are those two things. And so what should you be thinking about for next steps? I think you've got to understand yourself, first of all.
Yeah.
And when I say understand yourself, I mean first of all, from a profiling thing, like where are you right now? Right?
Yeah.
Because when you can understand that right now, in terms of say those two landmarks of that 50-meter sprint and your 2K or 1500-meter time, you can go, okay, I sit here on this continuum. Now I probably need a coach and an environment that has training partners that suit training those type of athletes.
Right.
Because if my desire is to have a career in the sport as a professional, or even in terms of life, like I want to go into a program that's going to suit what I'm bringing to the table. And it's that square peg round hole thing, right? Where places can have good reputations or good environments, and those are great. But if the training approach is very different to what you bring to the table, then I think you have to consider what the best fit is in that aspect. I also think that knowing yourself as an athlete is important, because it was really interesting to me in the episode with Carissa. She talked about how one of the important things for her was establishing like social support and like a network around where she was.
Mm-hmm.
And that's nothing to do with the training program or the track and a little bit the environment of the squad, but developing that support network where she was, right? And so I think as an athlete, before you're going into this environment or that environment, really understanding like, what do you need to be successful? Because every athlete is going to have a different thing that they need. Now, that's not saying that you need to be over demanding, and that's important too. Like, you can't have it all. But I think you need to know like, what are the one or two things that, hey, these are deal breakers for me, right? And that will help shape your decisions, because I think that's one of the big things that like I observed on those travels is like, you've got to get in the right environment for you and find the program that works for you. And we've both seen hundreds of athletes go through programs that they kind of go through because, you know, maybe their dad's friend was the coach or whatever it is, right? Or and those are great reasons to get into the sport. But if you're serious about really maximizing your potential, then I think there's an onus up front to go, okay, let's profile myself. Let's understand who I am, right? And then I can use that to really help guide and be the almost, guide of my North Star of my destiny, right? Because otherwise you leave a lot of things down to chance, and the environment you get into really shapes some of the opportunities that come your way. So I think that's a great starting point for anyone looking at next steps.
Yeah, man, I agree. And that those transitions, and we talked about them with Carissa, are tricky. And it's like you have to get a feel for the place and for the community. You know, the social network, like she said, coming in is so important. But then you also are getting to know these coaches and their theories in developing athletes. And I would just say ask a lot of questions. You know, if I had to add anything to that, it's just ask a lot of questions and get a feeling about a place. And you have to know who you are, but then you also have to remain a student and be flexible at the same time. And it's such a delicate balance to know yourself, but then continue to learn about yourself, at the same time. Golly, navigating that one.
Yeah, it's an ongoing process, even like you and I are working on that all the time, right? But I guess the main thing is to start, and you give yourself the best chance of having a good outcome.
Well, Gareth, I feel like we took a pretty good chunk out of what is speed for a distance runner. It's definitely something we can come back and dive deeper into different rabbit holes for sure. Hopefully I can have you back on soon.
Yeah, man, love to.